A bit of Bible trivia to begin this episode of the Discover the Word podcast. What person's name is the most mentioned in the Bible? That's not really all that tough to get number one. That's Jesus, of course, by a fairly wide margin. Top three, though, Jesus, David, and Moses. Well, this week on Discover the Word, we're actually going to focus our attention on someone who does crack the top 10, coming in at number 8, and maybe surprisingly more than Peter, more than Paul. The 8th most mentioned person's name in the Bible is Solomon. And what comes to mind first when you hear the name Solomon? Yeah, wisdom, right? The wisdom of Solomon. But as we're going to discover, as with most of us, one word is not sufficient to summarize a life. And so pull your chair up to the table with Bill Crowder, Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Vivian Mabuni as Bill leads the group in a study called It's Complicated, The Life of Solomon. Discover the Word with us next. And welcome to Discover the Word. I'm Brian Hettinga, and in this edition of the podcast, the group is going to explore the life of this significant contributor to the story of the Bible. And I think what we'll learn about God and about Solomon and about ourselves will provide a helpful perspective that in a lot of ways will be a cautionary tale of just how easy it is to lose track of what really is important in life and make choices that take us in a direction away from God. Because I heard someone say recently that generally we judge ourselves by our intentions. Others judge us by our actions. And I think that definitely enters into why we're calling this series of conversations that Bill and Elisa and Daniel and Vivian will have is It's Complicated, the life of Solomon.
Do you ever feel like sometimes you're around people who they're like walking contradictions?
Yeah. I'm a walking contradiction sometimes.
Are you comfortable explaining what you mean, Viv?
Well, I think sometimes I feel like I'm not consistent in anything. And so sometimes I'm fun and funny, and other times I'll kind of go deep. And I think most people seem to be contradictions in some ways, depending on how you define contradiction.
Sure.
Yeah, what do you exactly mean by that, Bill? That would
Well,
help.
I mean, you think about characters in the Bible, which is kind of where we spend most of our time together. And you think about Moses, who in Numbers 12 is described as the meekest of men, and yet he had breathtaking anger management problems, even though he was the meekest of men. You think about Paul, who said, the things that I don't want to do, I do. The things that I want to do, I don't do. I mean, that's kind of a contradiction in his life. David was a man after God's heart, and yet he was an adulterer and a murderer. That's pretty severe. So I just think that when we look at humans like us, it's good to be reminded that we're complex creatures and that we're not always what we want to be, and we're not always what we ought to be. We are what we are, and sometimes that requires some repentance and forgiveness. And the reason I brought that subject up, as abstract as it was, is because we want to spend this series of conversations talking about Solomon, who was considered the wisest man of his generation, and yet he ended up being extremely foolish in his life. And so that's kind of where we want to go. So that idea of contradictions is liable to jump out at us a few times. And when we look at Solomon's story, it takes us to 1 Kings chapter 3 in the Old Testament. The first evidence of a contradiction in Solomon's life is found in verse 3. Daniel, would you read that for us?
Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David. But
Yeah.
he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places.
Yeah. He loved the Lord, but
Yeah, he worshipped other gods. Yeah.
And it's probably worth describing the high places were the places where on tops of mountains or under trees or in places where typically other gods would be worshipped or idols would be worshipped. And so exactly, Elisa, it's like this contradiction between He's following in the footsteps of David. He's worshiping God. Oh, and he's also worshiping all these other idols in the high places.
Not to take that down too harshly, but it doesn't say that he was worshiping other gods. It was just saying he was sacrificing and burning incense. The contradiction was, if he was worshiping the God of Israel, he was doing the right thing in the wrong place, because they had a tabernacle, which was the place where those things were supposed to happen. So by doing it in the high places, it was like he was putting God on the same level with those false gods that you guys are talking about. Now, it doesn't say he wasn't worshiping false gods either, so we have to allow for that possibility. But either way, it's kind of a shocking statement. Solomon loved the Lord, but. And how many times does that need to be said about me? Well, yeah, Bill loves the Lord, but, he's kind of, it's a very human kind of statement. And so after it talks about that, God appears to Solomon in a dream and basically gives him a blank check and says, fill it out with whatever you want, which I love presenting that idea to crowds and when I'm teaching and say, okay, how do you fill in that blank? What do you write into that blank? And some people would say, I want my kids to know the Lord. And some people would say, I want our family to enjoy good health. And some would say, I want $100 million. People, how you fill in that blank check says something. And that's what brings us to verses 6 through 9. So since Daniel read verse 3 for us, Elisa and Viv, would you two kind of share verses 6 through 9 and get us through there? And see how Solomon fills in the blank check.
I'll start us, Viv. Then Solomon said, you have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you've reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you've given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day.
Lord my God, you have now made your servant king in my father David's place, yet I am just a youth with no experience in leadership. Your servant is among your people you have chosen, a people too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?
Okay. A couple of things. First of all, your translation, Viv, said, for I am but a youth. Mine says, I am but a little child. I mean, there's great humility in there, I think, which speaks to where Solomon's heart is at this point.
So, Bill, excuse me, just to orient us there, about how old was Solomon?
He was probably in his early 20s.
Okay,
at
thank
this
you.
point. Yeah, and the idea of I'm but a little child or I'm but a youth is, as Viv's translation brought out, speaks not only of age, but also lack of experience. He has no experience in leading a government. Now, Viv, would you read verse 9 again for us? Because this is where he makes his actual request, where he fills in the blank check.
So give your servant a receptive heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?
Okay, in Israel, in the ancient times, the king had three primary responsibilities. One was to administer the government. The second was to lead the armies into battle. And the third was to adjudicate interpersonal conflicts, which is fascinating because, if Daniel and I decided to get into a fight about something, I doubt that we could appeal to the White House. And yet in ancient Israel, any common person on the street could appeal to a hearing before the king, who would then make the decision between that person and whoever they were in conflict with. Notice he completely seems to skip the leading the armies and administering the government. He goes straight to the people part of the issue. He wants wisdom, an understanding heart, or a receptive heart, as Viv's translation says, to judge your people. Who is able to judge this great people of yours? That's really a very, very solid and dramatic, I think, request, don't you think?
Well, I'm thinking about other conversations we've had, especially ones Daniel's led us in, about justice. and who is able to actually administer justice. And God alone is the one who holds the purest attributes of both truth and grace. So that's echoing in me as we're in this conversation right now. Who is able to judge this great people of yours? Who but you, God?
Yeah, and there's also a sense, too, that like a lot of hopefulness should fill us at this point in the Solomon story, because it's like, oh, wow, he cares about people. It looks like he really wants to do the right thing.
And I think that there's one other thing that kind of adds to that humility and hopefulness that we're kind of talking about, and that's the fact that in 1 Kings chapter 2, David has already, before he passed away, he had already praised Solomon for his exceptional wisdom. And yet, even though, according to David, wisdom was one of Solomon's strengths, that's where he felt like he needed even more strengthening. And somebody wrote that probably the wisest moment that Solomon ever had in his life was the moment when he prayed for wisdom.
There's a lesson right there, Bill, isn't there? That
Yeah.
a stewarding of the very strength is to ask for the purity, the more of it, the God's perspective in that very strength. That's a real aha for me.
Yeah, and I think we'll see later in this series of conversations, Elisa, that God gives us good gifts, and we can either steward them, as you say, or we can abuse them. And when Solomon, the wise king, turns foolish, part of it is because he abuses the good gifts that God gives him. And we'll see the consequences of that later. But as we kind of wind down this opening conversation, we're just barely scratching the surface on Solomon. But I want us to look at one more verse because there's some real practical encouragement for us here too. Daniel, would you read for us James 1, verse 5?
Sure can. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to you.
That's quite a promise, isn't it? I mean, it's such a wonderful relief, in a sense, to know that when we face situations in life, we don't have to do it in our own know-how or in our own wisdom. As we face difficult challenges in life, we can go to our good God and we can ask him for wisdom, and he promises that he'll give it to us. That's a pretty good deal.
Good lesson to begin this study of what will become the more and more complicated life of Solomon. That wisdom is really a good thing to go to God for. Solomon asked him for it when so many other requests were a possibility, and we can ask God for it because he's ready and willing to provide it. And that was a good start to our Discover the Word study. It's complicated, the life of Solomon. And so Solomon asked God for wisdom to lead well and justly serve the nation of Israel. And so how do we know that God gave it to him? Well, there's an example that Solomon became famous for that demonstrated that he indeed had a way of displaying a special God-given kind of wisdom. So let's listen as they look at a test that would either prove or disprove that Solomon's request had been granted.
I've said this before, and I usually get some pretty odd looks when I do, but that's okay. I'm used to getting odd looks. When I graduated from Bible college, I went on the faculty for a couple of years and taught. And one of the things I learned through that process of teaching was that I really enjoyed giving tests.
That sounds mean.
And, just full disclosure, when I was a student, I enjoyed taking tests.
Okay, that's less mean. Okay.
It's less mean, but it's just as weird.
I think that's more weird,
Okay.
actually.
Yeah. I enjoyed taking tests because, to me, it was a way for me to understand what I had learned and what I had missed out on. And I found that to be helpful. When I was a teacher, the tests were helpful in a different way because not only did it test what the students had learned, it tested what I had taught. And if, like, for instance, if there was a particular question that I thought was really important on the test and everybody in the class missed it, then I knew I had failed to make that clear.
Now it just sounds mature. Seriously. I mean, on both sides, you're really after accomplishment and truth, not just like, oh, check the box. I think that's awesome, Bill.
Well, tests can serve a very profound purpose, and that's not just tests in the classroom. I mean, that's tests in life. Tests test us in ways that sometimes are uncomfortable, but can be instructive. And in a kind of a metaphorical sense, we're going to see Solomon on his first day on the job, if you will. I don't know that it's exactly his first day, but it's the first event recorded after he prays for and receives wisdom from God. And we're going to see that in verses 16 through 23 of 1 Kings chapter 3. So why don't we just read around there, and then we'll hit on a couple of things real quick and come back to it.
I'll start.
Okay.
All right. 1 Kings 3:16. Then 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was in the house. On the 3rd day after I gave birth, she also had a baby, and we were alone. No one else was with us in the house, just the 2 of us were there."
Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born.
Verse 22, then the other woman said, "No, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son." But the first woman said, "No, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son." Thus they spoke before the king.
Let me take you back to the first conversation for just a minute. Part of the king's job was to adjudicate between interpersonal conflicts, which meant people could have access to the throne room and present their case to him, even to prostitutes. I find that remarkable. I find that remarkable that they were able to do that, even just to come into his presence and present this. Now, some have questioned, why is this story here? Why did the narrator include
I'd be one
this
of those.
Yeah. Well, you would be asking a very good question, Daniel. This story is not included in Chronicles. And the reason is because the writers of Chronicles had a different agenda than the writers of Kings. The writers of Kings wanted to show Solomon's credentials through events like this and like the Queen of Sheba coming to visit and all those different things. The writer of Chronicles focuses on Solomon's greatness by the building of the temple. And so they're telling the same story, but from radically different angles to do radically different things. And here's why I think it's important. How did Saul and David become king?
They were anointed.
Okay.
Samuel anointed them.
The representative of God in the nation, Samuel the prophet, anointed them. Solomon wasn't anointed.
Really?
He was a political appointee. As a matter of fact, Nathan the prophet, who you remember from the David and Bathsheba incident, actually teamed up with Bathsheba to go to David and convince him to name Solomon to be the next king. Saul and David were anointed. Solomon is appointed. Now, Saul and David had some kind of an endorsement of God's favor because they'd been anointed by Samuel. This story is here to show the people that Solomon's got God's endorsement because he's displaying God's wisdom. And we see that in verse 28. It says, when all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. There's the validation that didn't come from a prophetic anointing. It came from the event with these women. So with all that kind of background in mind, let's pick it up at verse 23 and read through verse 27.
Then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead,' while the other says, 'Not so, your son is dead, and my son is the living one.' So the king said, 'Bring me a sword.'" Yeah, this story, whatever. And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, "Divide the living boy in two, then give half to the one and half to the other."
Then verse 26, the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "He shall neither be mine nor yours. Divide him." Then the king said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill her. She is his mother."
Okay, Daniel, I think any right-thinking person would agree with you that this is not the most pleasant story we've ever read in the Bible.
It is violent, but I have always been deeply moved by it. And it's like the wisdom to take a risk to reveal what is truth. Only the real mother would step up and sacrifice that child to give that child life.
And if you go back to our first conversation, when Solomon prayed for wisdom, he specifically prayed, "So give your servant an understanding heart." The idea of that understanding is emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
He's tapping into some emotional intelligence here to trigger a response in these women that will reveal to him the truth, because he doesn't have any way to prove this case either way. I mean, it's not like they can go out and do a DNA test or something, They don't have any way to solve this problem unless he can trigger the truth out of them.
That's good.
And he does that through an understanding heart. And what's interesting is, as you were reading about the mom whose child was the living one, it said she was deeply stirred. In ancient Hebrew thought, the bowels, or in women, the womb, was seen as the seat of emotions. And the idea of the words deeply stirred is that she was stirred in her womb for this child that she had given birth to. And so she responded, as you said, Elisa, as a true mother would respond. And in that sense, it takes a very ugly picture and turns it beautiful.
I think that story is such a reflection of what love really is, and that love is caring for another, even if it is not to my benefit. And that's such a display of what real love is.
There's also an extent to God's care for the most vulnerable. And you have two prostitutes. Where's the guys that got them pregnant, right? They're not in this story. They're not there to help protect this child.
So good, Daniel.
So you have two very vulnerable women in the presence of the king. So already just hearing this story for the first time would have been shocking at the idea that you have these two prostitutes, these two very vulnerable women. All they have is a living child and a dead child. So already you see this king who's supposed to be a representative of God's justice taking the time to situate between two vulnerable women. On top of that, do something that shows care for children. And so there is almost a theme of justice in this story that goes beyond just the justice of this moment, but also the care for these women and for the children there.
And it clearly had the intended impact on the people, because when the story circulated throughout the country, people marveled that the wisdom of God was in him. And that validated him as their king. Now, I'm just stuck on the fact that these two women of low estate in a patriarchal culture still have access to the king. And I would just remind us today that we also have a king. And so just as they were able to turn to their king, we can go boldly into the presence of our king and come before his throne, which is one of mercy and grace, and find grace to help us in our time of need.
Yeah, we often refer to it as the wisdom of Solomon, but it's really God's wisdom funneled through Solomon. And isn't it great to know that we have access to that wisdom as well? Well, next we'll talk about what Bill calls Solomon's Mount Everest, the high point of his life. But we'll also discover how challenging handling success well can be. It's complicated. The life of Solomon continues after a word about the book that Bill wrote, that expands on what we're talking about in this edition of the Discover the Word podcast. Well, as we study what will be the complicated life of King Solomon in this episode, I also want to tell you about a book that fills in even more of Solomon's story. King Solomon, from Our Daily Bread Publishing, was written by Bill Crowder, who also used that material to build this study that we're doing. Bill had served in the pastorate for more than 20 years before joining Our Daily Bread Ministries, and with us now, he has published more than 20 books, spoken extensively around the world in Bible conferences for our global offices, and of course hosts Discover the Word. Bill is a trusted friend, and in an excerpt from the book, he writes, "As we consider key moments in the life of Solomon, we will see his tremendous strengths as well as his powerful and ultimately self-destructive blind spots. Solomon's story is a cautionary tale, reminding us that we too are vulnerable. We too can drift. We too can be our own worst enemies." And I hope you'll get your copy of King Solomon and discover what we can learn about living wisely today. You can search for it on our OurDailyBreadPublishing.org website. Just search King Solomon by Bill Crowder at OurDailyBreadPublishing.org. All right, so in this next part of the conversation, we look at what is generally considered to be the crowning achievement of the life of wise King Solomon. And that's saying something. Ancient Israel enjoyed its golden age of power and wealth and influence during the reign of King Solomon. And so what was this Mount Everest accomplishment? Well, that's what we discover as our study, It's Complicated, the Life of Solomon, continues.
I think all of us have times in life where we have ups and we have downs. We have high moments and we have low moments. We have mountain peaks and we have deep, dark valleys like the valley of the shadow of death. That's part of what makes life challenging, isn't it? Navigating the in-between, between the mountaintop and the valley and back.
Well, it's easier to navigate the going up toward the mountaintop, in between. It's a lot more uncomfortable when you start recognizing that you're going downward toward the valley.
Yeah, the grief of life, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I'm so appreciating this series of conversations, Bill, because I think it pushes up against our presumption that the Christian life is one way or another, that it's level. Let's put it that way. And, people are so complicated. Life is so complicated. And the older we get, the more I'm able to embrace that. But I really appreciate that in this character of Solomon. So yeah, peaks and valleys, they're both of them, aren't there?
And the thing about peaks is that we've seen a bit of a peak already with Solomon, with the display of wisdom that kind of wins the hearts of the people to their newly appointed king. Now we're going to see what is generally considered to be the true Mount Everest of Solomon's life. And sadly, from here, it's kind of downhill all the way. But the high point of his life is the building of the temple. And to kick off that part of our conversation, Vivian, would you read 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1?
Sure. Solomon began to build the temple for the Lord in the 480th year, after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of his reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month.
Now, that's to us, that kind of sounds like a bunch of throwaway details and stuff. But to the Jewish mind, that's critically important because it positions Solomon at a point in history, and it also connects what's going on now back with the most important national event they had ever had, and that was the Exodus. And there's almost a sense, some scholars think, in which this is saying this is an Exodus-like moment. That's how important this temple is. It's an Exodus-like moment for the nation of Israel. And there's some reasons for that, but I just want to kind of start off by asking, how does that hit you?
Well, how many years was it, Bill, that they were in Egypt before the Exodus?
It was over 400.
Yeah, so 400 years, and then here we have 480 years. So there's almost like a time marker as well of distance, where it's like, hey, the same amount of time that you were stuck in Egypt as slaves, the same amount of time has gone past, and now the temple's going to be built.
And by connecting it back to the Exodus, you're right, Daniel, by connecting it back to the Exodus, there's one remaining visible reminder of the Exodus, and that's the tabernacle. And that's now being done away with. The temple is going to replace the tabernacle that was built for the first time there at the foot of Mount Sinai when they received the law of Moses. So there's a lot of interconnectivity between these events that continue to link back. And of course, we know that even today among observant Jews, the Passover is celebrated every year as a reminder of the Exodus. Again, that is still this critical moment in Jewish history that is not allowed to be forgotten. So here you have this huge benchmark of the Exodus. Now you get a second benchmark of the building of the temple.
The other thing that jumps out too is really what God promised Abraham still hasn't been fully realized yet. They're almost there, right? Like to be fully established in the land, they wanted to do what all ancient Near Eastern cultures would do, which is they wanted to have a temple for their God to dwell in. And so at that point, once the temple's finished, that would be the moment in which most likely culturally they'd be like, Abraham,
exactly.
The promise to Abraham is finally now realized. We're fully established in the land.
I think that's so rich, Daniel, because I was thinking the same thing, that so much of the story has been temporary-ish, and this is like a permanence.
Yeah. I'm thinking like temple-wise, as a North American Christian, I don't think I understand the significance of the centrality of the temple. So I think the understanding of the weight of this moment is huge. I mean, this was David, getting all of the resources together to build the temple, and he wasn't allowed to build the temple because of so much bloodshed. So because we have churches everywhere, I don't think we have this central location spot and what that signified of the presence of God. There's something really weighty here that deserves pause.
Yeah, it was the center of their national life, both spiritually and nationally, and that was evidenced by the fact that even when you move into the time of Christ, you still see the people 3 times a year making the pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the 3 major feasts. And when they come to the temple, they're coming to the temple that was built on what had been, in more ancient times, Mount Moriah, which also speaks back to the promise of Abraham, Daniel, because on Mount Moriah was where he took Isaac, his only son, to offer him as a sacrifice, and God provided a ram instead. That Mount Moriah is the land that David offered a sacrifice when he was king, and he purchased the land, and that was the place where you find in Chronicles the temple was built. The Temple Mount was Mount Moriah. So you see all these connections throughout the story, tying it all together, and it does, as you said, Daniel, go back to Abraham. But there's one other little connection that I think is really kind of interesting, just as an aside. In the Exodus, when they came through the Red Sea and they were safely on the other side and the armies of Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea and all that, Moses celebrated by singing this impromptu hymn that he was just kind of composing on the fly, it seems like. And when you get to the next to the last verse, listen to what he says. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, your place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. So even in Moses' hymn of praise, he was anticipating a permanent dwelling place for God in the land of promise. And that's what the temple was all about. During the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, the tabernacle had been the centerpiece of life. Now the temple would take its place and become the new centerpiece of life for Israel. So when we come to the building of the temple, it's going to take a while to build it, as you can imagine. And they bring in the best workers and the best materials. And then in chapter 8 is when they have the dedication of the temple. And when they have that dedication, I think it'd be good to maybe read Solomon's benediction, his declaration of blessing in chapter 8, verses 54 through 61, and see not only what he says about the dedication of this temple, but especially where he ends it up in a challenge to the people. So 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 54 through 61.
I'll start.
Okay.
When Solomon finished praying this entire prayer and petition to the Lord, he got up from kneeling before the altar of the Lord with his hands spread out toward heaven. And he stood and blessed the whole congregation of Israel with a loud voice. Blessed be the Lord. He has given rest to his people Israel according to all he has said. Not one of all the good promises he has made through his servant Moses has failed. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he not abandon us or leave us, so that he causes us to be devoted to him, to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commands, statutes, and ordinances which he commanded our ancestors.
Let these words of mine, with which I pleaded before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night. And may he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people, Israel, as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God, there is no other.
And may your hearts be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands, as at this time.
Okay, the part that Vivian read for us, I thought had a lot of echoes to what Daniel was saying about connecting all of this to the promise of Abraham. Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people. I mean, in a sense, they had theoretically had rest because they'd been in the land for a long time. But now there seems to be this sense of culmination, of fulfillment that brings a new day of rest to the people of Israel.
It's very revelationally, It's like this is the permanent dwelling of God, and that's what Revelation is revealing about, the hereafter. It's a promise of that, I think, depth and power.
Yeah. Yeah, and for us, you say, well, okay, all that's really interesting. There's some nice little factoids in there and some little data points that are interesting. What's that got to do with me? Well, what it has to do with us as followers of Jesus is that during the Exodus, the tabernacle was representative of the dwelling place of God among his people. Then when the temple was established, the temple became representative of the dwelling place of God among his people. But when we come to the New Testament, we have Emmanuel. We have God physically with us in a human form. And now, after his ascension, for those of us who are Christ followers, we are the temples of the Holy Spirit. Our bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit, both individually and corporately as the larger body of Christ. We have God's presence with us always, even to the point of answering the prayer that Solomon had, that God would never leave us or forsake us. That promise is underlined in Hebrews chapter 13 to remind us that Emmanuel was not just when Jesus was walking on the earth. Emmanuel is every day of our lives. God is with us. He is present, and probably means we ought to live accordingly.
Yeah, I think for me, too, as I think about this, God never fit in a temple.
Right.
And the whole story of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, is like God doesn't fit in the human boxes that we try to make him fit in. And he was very happy tenting with his people in the tabernacle and being present among them at the center of the community. And we see very quickly after this moment in the temple, Ezekiel even describes his presence leaving the temple and going with them into exile. So it wasn't the temple that was going to control God or put him into a box or keep him from being present with his people. But it takes us until Acts to see that God doesn't live in a temple made by human hands, but desires to live with his people. Even if for David and his desire and Solomon, who actually built the temple, even if their desire was to build a physical representation of God being with them, ultimately this was a God that would never fit in that temple because it was a God that wanted to be with his people.
Sometimes in some traditions today, we hear the church building referred to as the house of God. Is it? Or are we?
Yeah, the house of God's people. Yeah.
The I am is with us, and he will never leave us or forsake us. And just as Moses celebrated that on the far side of the Red Sea, and Solomon celebrated that at the dedication of the temple, we can celebrate that every day, knowing that whatever we're facing in life, we don't face it alone. Our God is with us.
Yeah, important conversation about Solomon and how the temple he is credited with building is a key piece of that God with us theme that runs throughout the Bible. And while there have been some complicated things about Solomon's life up to this point in our study, from here on is where he kind of came up with the title for our study being called It's Complicated, the Life of Solomon. And so what were the factors in Solomon's struggles from here on out? Why does this become a cautionary tale about someone best known for being wise? Well, that's where we go next.
Can you have too much of a good thing?
You can't have too much love, Bill, but you can't have too much cake. So which one are we talking about?
It's so funny because I took economics in college. I remember nothing except for the law of diminishing marginal returns, which means that your first Oreo cookie is the best one, and then it kind of goes downhill from there. And after a while, you just can't have any more Oreo cookies. So
true with ice cream too. As soon as the fat of the milk coats your mouth, you don't taste it as well afterwards. So it's that first lick or that first spoonful that's the best.
Wow.
I read somewhere that every roller coaster ever built, every skydiving event, every bungee jump, every zip line was all trying to replicate the thrill of the first time a kid sat on a swing. Yeah, there's something about us that moment, we keep wanting to feel it over and over again, and it's really not able to be duplicated. And so that's why you end up doing more and more and more and getting less and less and less out of it. Just for the record, Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead said, too much of a good thing is just about right.
Oh.
And the blonde bombshell of decades past, Mae West, said, too much of a good thing can be wonderful. But Aesop of Aesop's Fable said, it is possible to have too much of a good thing. And he's referring to the fact that a life of excess can create buku problems.
Yeah.
So what is the alternative to a life of excess?
A life of poverty.
Contentment.
I think contentment, Daniel.
You didn't agree with me, huh?
No, I didn't, because nowhere are we told in the scriptures that there's particular holiness in being poor. But there is great godliness with contentment. And I think that to find that sweet spot of contentment where you can honestly say, this is enough. I don't need more than this. And that's a hard balance to strike in a consumer-oriented culture like the one we live in, where everybody's wanting that fifth television set or that fourth iPhone or whatever, where we are constantly bombarded with all of these things that will make our lives so much better. And I think contentment is the sweet spot that we strive for and find a hard time to get that balance right in there. So this brings us back to our friend Solomon and his peaks and valleys and ups and downs and wisdom and foolishness. And in this conversation, we're going to see his excess, his life of excess. We saw him at his high point in our last conversation in the dedication of the temple, and now we start to see the road down. We start to see him heading toward the lowest valley of his life, which we'll get into in our final conversation. But in this fourth conversation, I just want you to read a few verses.
Now Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms, from the river to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you see that, to me, the key phrase in there is for one day. Mm-hmm. That was his provision for one day. Now, first of all, this could speak of the general prosperity of Israel under Solomon's reign. And in all likelihood, even though this was his provision for one day, this may also include all the people that were under his umbrella, if you will.
I wonder too, though, Bill, we're talking about chapter 10 being like the beginning of the downfall because of the excess. But I can't help but notice in chapter 4, when he's listing off all of his leaders of his kingdom, at the end of verse 6, it says, and Adoniram, son of Abda, who was in charge of the slavery or forced labor. So there's already like a hint in chapter 4, even after he's received quote unquote wisdom from God, that he's using slave labor. And then we talked about the temple, and you had mentioned in passing it took a long time to build. We see that at the end of chapter 6, he was 7 years in building it. But then immediately in chapter 7, it says Solomon was building his own house 13 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So like we're already getting these glimpses even before this of like, yeah, he's kind of about God, he's kind of about wisdom, but he's really about himself too.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give you a sense of scale on this, Lisa, you read his provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal. We don't measure things in cores, at least we don't in my house. And a core was actually a donkey load, or the equivalent of about 185 bushels. So 30 cores, 30 donkey loads of flour and 30 donkey loads of meal. I mean, that's a lot of grain for one day.
Mm-hmm.
And think about that in contrast with all of the people that he has in forced labor and slavery, who they're not getting that food. And so even the way that he's getting these things, the way he's acquiring it, it's definitely the opposite of what he had prayed for in chapter 3.
Yeah. And Vivian, would you read for us verses 26 and 27 of 1 Kings chapter 10? This takes it in a different direction.
Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. These deputies provide for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table, each in his month. They left nothing lacking. They also brought barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds to the place where they should be, each according to his charge.
Now, whereas all of the vast amounts of food material that we saw in the early thing, which could be for feeding himself and his household in rather lavish ways, the purpose of the chariots is all about national security. In the ancient world, chariots were the cutting edge of military technology, and so the greatest military security was in an abundance of chariots and horses. And so there's a sense in which he's trying to create a sense of security through these horses and chariots. But again, he's doing it in a way that is stepping outside the bounds of wisdom, because he's going against what God had told Israel when they went into the promised land. In Deuteronomy 17, when it talks about one day you'll have a king, God says, moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. There was a sense in which they were, as a people of God, to see their security in God. And the accumulation of horses and chariots, while it might be prudent on a national level, it is not entrusting your security to God, and it goes outside that level of trust that God was calling for. And so as we look at that, whether it's trying to find our security in anything other than God, or trying to find happiness and pleasure and satisfaction in the accumulation of material things, too much of a good thing can be really destructive.
Yeah, it reminds me of in Proverbs chapter 30, and this seems to me a really great place that addresses it. It's the prayer. It's a request. Give me neither poverty nor wealth. Feed me with the food I need. Otherwise, I might have too much and deny you, saying, who is the Lord? Or I might have nothing and steal, profaning the name of my God. And I think that balance is going to look different for people. What is too much for me may not be too much for my friend. And God seems to at least know us and know when too much of a good thing it becomes idolatry.
And I think that's once again where we land on this idea of the need for contentment, which clearly it was difficult in Solomon's day. I think in some ways it has to be more difficult for us today because we're constantly bombarded with images of so many things that we are told we need to accumulate. And like you said, Daniel, those things cannot bring lasting happiness and cannot secure lasting happiness for us. And finding that sweet spot of contentment, whether it's content with a certain level of minimalism or a certain level of possession, is still the best place to be in our relationship with God and with others and our relationship with things.
Yeah, this is where we see the life of Solomon becoming more and more complicated. And the trajectory of his life becomes this cautionary tale of how easy it is to lose track of what's really important and make choices that take us in a direction away from God. The struggle with contentment is a big part of Solomon's downfall. And in the last segment of this conversation, we'll see another factor that contributed to Solomon's downward slide. It's a factor that we need to pay attention to as well. But before we talk about that, let's take a moment to glance ahead at what the group will study in the next Discover the Word podcast. Next time on the Discover the Word podcast, the group will be welcoming New Testament scholar and professor Dr. David Turner to the table for a series called Prophecy, Prophets, and Jesus. Now, there is a lot of interest in prophecy today. Actually, there's always been. But are the prophets in the Bible primarily spiritual meteorologists who forecast history and write it down before it happens? Is that what a prophet is?
We have this popular idea out there that prophets are about predictions. Mm-hmm. So they're not that different from meteorologists who tell us what the weather's going to be.
That's good.
So I guess the thing I want us to think about here is that prophets weren't just throwing predictions out. They were speaking for God through His Holy Spirit. I'm trying to get away from the word prediction when it comes to the prophets. I want to use the word promise.
I'll be part of these intriguing conversations as Dr. David Turner explores prophecy, prophets, and Jesus with us, and explains how Jesus was Israel's last great prophet. And so how did they and how do we respond to the promise, the message that he came to bring? Don't miss our next study on Discover the Word. Well, this study of the life of Solomon that we've called It's Complicated has not been an exhaustive study by any means. There's a lot about Solomon in Scripture that we haven't touched on. But I hope that this has at least introduced you to his contribution to the story of the Bible. And so we're going to close now by talking about one of the major lessons we learn from this story. We're going to talk about influence and the importance of who and what we choose to or allow to influence us. So let's listen as Bill and Elisa and Daniel and Vivian wrap up this episode discussing influence.
When we think about influencing people, the power of influence, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
You can go either way with that.
It kind of depends on what you do with it. And if you're the one being influenced, choosing who you allow to influence you can be one of the most important life decisions you can ever make, right?
Definitely. We become like the people we spend time with or look to.
And that implies that we're conscious enough to even recognize that we're being influenced, because all of us have been influenced over and over again by others, regardless of whether we notice it or not. So there is an extent to which we choose to be influenced at times by people, but then there's also an extent in which we're shaped by others just by being around people in general.
Inadvertently.
Yep.
I think in all of this conversation, there's also a warning to people who find themselves in the position of being influencers, whether it be social media influencers, which I know is a hot thing right now, or whether it be people in positions of leadership who have people looking to them for guidance and wisdom and example. There's a sense in which being in a position of influence and having the power of influence can be a tremendous burden and a difficult one to bear. For this conversation, our final conversation on Solomon, we started off in the right place with him praying for wisdom. We're going to have him in the wrong place, being influenced further and further and further away from the God he loved in 1 Kings chapter 3. He loved the Lord, but now we're going to see what happens when you mix in all that other influence and stuff. So to kind of kick us off, just to get a outside view, Daniel's reminded us that much of what we've been seeing about Solomon so far has actually been written by some of Solomon's historians, perhaps. So let's get an outside voice in Nehemiah 13, verses 26 and 27.
Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women?
Now, when we get to any kind of a passage like this, I hasten to say here that this is not about ethnicity. When it's talking about foreign women, it's not talking about ethnic differences, because all the surrounding tribes were Semitic tribes, ultimately. What this is about is the warning that was given back in Deuteronomy 17, where the warning was given when you have a king. After it talked about what we saw in the last conversation about not multiplying horses, it says, he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. He shall not multiply wives to himself. That was important because the foreign wives would bring their gods with them and could turn his heart away from the God of Israel and to these foreign gods. And that is exactly what happened with Solomon. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 11. And Daniel, in our very first conversation, you pointed out that in 1 Kings chapter 3, it reminds us that Solomon's first marriage was to an Egyptian princess.
Yeah.
So his very first marriage was outside of the instructions that God himself had laid out for Israel's kings. Now we see what happens when you take that to excess. In 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 3, well, make it 1 through 4. Who'd like to read that for us?
Okay. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after other gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been.
It's interesting that the narrator inserts David in here because there's a sense in which Solomon is following David's bad example.
Yeah,
because David had at least 8 or 10 wives.
It is interesting. Yeah.
And now this is 8 or 10 wives on steroids. I mean, 700 princess wives, which would be political alliance marriages.
Yeah.
And then the concubines would have been Solomon's personal harem, the women that he kept for his own personal pleasure or enjoyment. And when you think about that, you think 1,000 wives. And I have the most wonderful wife who has ever walked the face of this earth, but I only need one.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's madness in this almost, to think that he could accumulate 1,000 wives and somehow keep his bearings is crazy talk.
And part of that's just it is extreme, but culturally, at that time, the idea of the king, it's almost vulgar to say it this way, but spreading his seed was really important for him to have as many children as possible, to have as many alliances for safety as possible, for all of these things were a part of establishing a kingdom.
Yeah. Well, I hear what you're saying, Daniel, and I don't disagree with you that there's a cultural component to this, but there's also a command component to this.
Yeah, definitely.
God had given extremely clear instructions to what a king was to do and was not to do. And even though it may have been culturally acceptable and even expected for him to have all these political alliance marriages and to build a large harem to have all these children and stuff, even though all that might have been culturally acceptable, it goes back again to David and his night with Bathsheba. Even though culturally as king, he had the right, in the eyes of the people, he had the right to take whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Even though that might have been considered okay in the eyes of the people, it was not okay in the eyes of God. And the extremes to which this pushes Solomon are picked up in verse 5 through 8. Who wants to pick up with 1 Kings 11, verse 5?
Solomon followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abhorrent idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and unlike his father David, he did not remain loyal to the Lord. At that time, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abhorrent idol of Moab, and for Milcom, the abhorrent idol of the Ammonites, on the hill across from Jerusalem. He did the same for all his foreign wives who were burning incense and offering sacrifices to their gods.
And just to give you a little bit of background on some of these gods, my Bible translates Milcom as Molech.
Yeah.
And Molech, the worship of Molech,
kids.
yeah, you sacrificed kids in the fire. Ashtoreth was the goddess of sex and fertility, and her worship was involved all kinds of licentious activities and things of that nature. I mean, when you put the whole package together, you know, there's this contradiction here that shows us how far Solomon has fallen from that humble young man who saw his desperate need of wisdom and prayed for it.
And yet, you know, I know we're doing the Solomon thing, but I mean, every one of us can put our names in the blank. You know, Elisa loved the Lord, but, you know, and then put your own. I think our tendency is to push away the disobedience and make it all about somebody else. You know, when I think the stories are here to lovingly help us see what is our but.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think this story's here, though, because if we make this story just about Solomon, then we're missing the big story that the Bible's trying to tell us, too. And so even Solomon's story is so much more about this big story that the Bible's telling. And that's really what the prophets pick up on, is like even in the best days of Israel's time, things still fell apart. There was still slavery. There was still injustice. There was idol worship. All of these bad things were happening. We need a new kind of king. We need a different kind of king. And so this story, more than almost any other story in some ways, really sets us up to need Jesus, which you're right, Elisa, ties all of us and our own brokenness into the story as well, because we should identify with Solomon, maybe not quite his wealth, but with his struggles.
Yeah.
And we need Jesus as well. And so Jesus becomes that king that fulfills that.
I love that, Daniel. And I love that Jesus, you know, it's never said about him, he loved God, but, you know, he is the one and true king who followed and to the point of sacrificing for us on the cross. It's beautiful. Yeah.
I think this is, you know, one of the reasons why I so enjoy doing character studies in the Bible. Because if we are willing to put ourselves in that blank, if we are willing to see how those stories point us to our true and better king, then I think there's great benefit for us if we can learn from the downfalls and failings of others, as well as from their high points and their successes. There's a lot for us to benefit from as we see people in another culture, in another time, trying to live in relationship with God in a broken world. And that's what we're trying to do too. And we can learn a lot from Solomon on that.
In addition to that, Solomon seems to me to be someone we can learn from, that there are consequences to sin. Sometimes for me, I will downplay my sin and not think it's that big of a deal and it's okay. But there are real consequences to disobedience, and not to be all about moral formation and trying just to keep our nose clean, but really that loyal love, that loyalty to God. That here we were just reading in 1 Kings 11 that Solomon did what was evil. He did not remain loyal to the Lord. There's something about our heart's posture of loyalty and faithfulness to our Lord. And there are consequences. I think we become numbed out from the Holy Spirit convicting us of our sin.
That's
if
good.
we keep ignoring it, we will kind of drown out the voice of the Spirit. And so there's a warning that there are consequences to our sin.
So when it comes to the power of influence in our lives and who we allow to influence, I think allowing us to be influenced and guided and directed by the Holy Spirit is obviously the best influence we could have. And others around us who are Spirit-filled followers of Jesus can also be good and healthy influences for us that can move us in a better and a more healthy direction in our pursuit of real, true loyalty to our God.
You know, Bill, as I think back over all these conversations, the spot where I see the most wisdom from Solomon is back in his dedication of the temple, and it's chapter 8, verse 57. And I think there's a really beautiful maybe promise or prayer for us today in this too. He says, "The Lord our God be with us, as he was with our ancestors. May he not leave us or abandon us, but incline our hearts to him, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his ordinances, which he commanded our ancestors." Because one of the things that we can come away from a conversation like this feeling is a lot of pressure to try to do the right things and not be like Solomon. And yet embedded in that little prayer that Solomon prayed is, God, we need your help to incline our hearts to follow you. And that is a beautiful prayer for all of us to learn from Solomon. God, incline our hearts to follow you, for you truly know what's best.
Yeah, we've said a number of times over the course of the last hour that Solomon's story is in a lot of ways a cautionary tale, one that, while filled with promise and potential, also contains significant drift and decline into really bad decisions. And so I hope you found this study called It's Complicated, The Life of Solomon helpful, and at the same time challenging and convicting because, Solomon's path is a path that we could easily follow. Well, you've been studying with Bill Crowder, Elisa Morgan, Daniel Ryan Day, and Vivian Mabuni here on Discover the Word, the small group Bible study where we invite you to explore with us topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. And don't forget that Bill has a new book out that contains even more on the complicated life of Solomon. It's from Our Daily Bread Publishing, and it's called King Solomon, Life Lessons from the Wisest Man Who Ever Lived. I think having been part of this study on Discover the Word, you'll discover even more what King Solomon can teach us about living both wisely and foolishly today. You can get a copy by going to our OurDailyBreadPublishing.org website and searching King Solomon by Bill Crowder. Now, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and you may not know this, but in addition to our radio programs and podcasts, devotionals, and books, we also have unique programs reaching people with specific needs around the globe. One example would be our Be a Light project in Indonesia, which distributes packages including a solar light and Bible engagement material to remote villages without electricity. We are so grateful for your support that makes it possible for us to share the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible with people around the world. Get involved at discovertheword.org and click the Donate button up at the top of the page. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Headinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries.